Bela Raphael Simons's first steps at LaGuardia Field in 1946 were documented by a crowd of photographers watching her every move as she met her adoptive mother, Jean Simons. Jean's husband, Bert, an army sergeant stationed in occupied Berlin, had spent months after World War II battling to bring Bela to the United States. Her arrival in New York appeared to be a happy ending for a child whose biological parents had been killed in Auschwitz. Jean posed with Bela, but the beatific newspaper photos of mother and child masked a more complicated truth. For one thing, Jean was not an entirely willing participant. And for another, 3-year-old Bela, who obtained the first refugee visa out of Berlin, had landed in a country that wasn't eager to take in her or anyone like her. Bela was among the first in a wave of European immigrants coming to America to escape the aftermath for World War II, the greatest refugee crisis in the last century. And yet public sentiment was opposed to immigration. More than 2/3 of Americans then objected to allowing Jews and other Europeans into the United States. For comparison, an April 2017 Pew Research Center poll found that 48% of Americans don't believe the U.S. has a responsibility to accept Syrian refugees. Bela's haven with her adopted parents was short-lived. Within a year of her arrival, Bert and Jean divorced. Jean left Brooklyn, moved to Florida and remarried. Bert moved to Virginia and remarried. Neither took custody of their adopted war waif, and the last documented instance of the name Bela Simons was on the information sheet filled out upon her arrival into the United States by the Immigration and Naturalization Service. Bela died before she even got to the U.S., Beth Jaff Davis said. "My mother was always Ruth." On a crisp April afternoon at Yorktown, in Westchester County, Ms. Jaff Davis and her parents sat around a long table with a spread of lox and bagels, a movie playing in the background in the living room. She and her father, Ted Jaff, interrupted each other to tell the remarkable saga of Bela, or Ruth, as she has been called since the moment she arrived in New York. Beth, an archivist for the Rockefeller Archive Center in nearby Sleepy Hollow, NY, is extroverted and outspoken, unlike her mother, the woman at the center of these stories. Ruth Saperstein Jaff, 75, has cropped chestnut hair and wears thick glasses, speaks quietly and with a strong accent, but one more redolent of New York City than Germany. She wears a brace on her right leg that causes a slight limp when she walks. Hers is the quintessential suburban home on a quiet, hilly street, where the lawn was freshly mowed and neighbors know one another's names. Outside the house, a large American flag fluttered in the breeze. Ruth and Ted, who retired in 2002 after driving a UPS truck for 30 years, have lived here almost since marrying in 1966. Their living room walls were sprinkled with portraits of their 2 children, Beth and Leonard, and 5 grandchildren. One frame displayed a 1946 front page of the New York Daily News with the photograph of a grinning toddler. Gets home and country, meet a new citizen for Brooklyn. She's Bela Raphael, 3½ whose parents were killed by the Gestapo at Auschwitz. Read the caption, which used the Polish spelling of Auschwitz and misspelled the name she was given by her biological parents. The framed page was a gift from Beth. Ruth would rather put Bela behind her, and for the most part, she has. She has no memory of her life in Berlin and doesn't recall much about Sergeant Simons, either, or the months she spent with him. She remembers him later on. After the war he was a ham operator, she said. He would get connected to different people. Despite the fuzzy memory, Ruth keeps her own connection with Bert. She named her daughter Beth in his honor. Sergeant Simons fought in Europe as part of the American Army's 103rd Infantry Division. After the horrors at the Battle of the Bulge, he made an oath. If he survived the war, he promised himself, he would adopt a child who was a victim of the Nazis. 5 months after the German surrender, he found himself in Berlin as part of the American effort to rebuild the city. Thanks to letters and telegrams that he sent back home to his sister Lottie during that time, Beth and Ruth have cobbled together a fairly detailed narrative of the remarkable efforts of Sergeant Simons to make good on his pledge. Sergeant Simons, who grew up an observant Jew in Monticello, NY, approached Capt. Harry Nowelski during high holiday services at a temple that Captain Nowelski helped rebuild, the first Berlin synagogue to reopen after the war. Captain Nowelski, an American lawyer charged with denazifying Berlin, had also established the only Jewish orphanage in Berlin. The orphanage aimed to alleviate the overcapacity displaced persons camps set up by the United Nations. In the months after the end of the war, more than 1 million refugees roamed the western occupied zone. As Sergeant Simons and Captain Nowelski toured the orphanage, dozens of children crowded around them, hoping for candy. Sergeant Simons, judging from photographs, must have been a commanding presence, tall and broad-shouldered in full uniform, a paratrooper's cap above wire-rimmed glasses. A little girl dashed into his arms, he told the Associated Press in 1946. "Hell, Captain," the sergeant remembered saying in a letter he later sent to Captain Nowelski. "All the kids look alike when they are so young, I'll have this one." The girl was Bela. He offered her chocolate, which she stuffed in her mouth, wrapper and all. The next day Sergeant Simons wrote his sister, telling her he'd selected a child deserving of a new life. He also sent a telegram notifying Jean that she was about to become a mother. Through the Jüdische Gemeinde zu Berlin, the Jewish community in Berlin, Ruth later learned that her biological mother was named Zilla Raphael. She also discovered she had a twin who died shortly after their birth and that she'd had a half-sister as well. Ruth now believes she was saved because Zilla worked in Berlin's Jewish hospital, which also functioned as a jail and a deportation center during the war, according to Refuge in Hell, How Berlin's Jewish Hospital Outlasted the Nazis, a book by Daniel B. Silver, former General Counsel of the National Security Agency and the Central Intelligence Agency. Both her parents and her half-sister were sent to Auschwitz. But Zilla managed to hide her in the hospital. In the late 1990s, when Ruth decided to file for reparations with the Claims Conference, which negotiates with the German government on behalf of Holocaust victims, she and her daughter began piecing the story of how she landed in New York. On the April afternoon I visited, Beth laid out dozens of clippings and more than 120 copies of letters and telegrams that Sergeant Simons wrote to his sister while he was in Germany. Regarding the murkier pieces of the story, the family has its theories. The way the story goes is that Bert wanted to adopt a little Jewish orphan, Beth said, and in the middle of the process he gets a Dear John letter. Neither Ruth nor Beth knew much about Jean Simons before she left Brooklyn. In 1947, she married Meyer Koshkin in Florida. They had a daughter, Dina Altman, who lives in San Diego with her family. Ms. Altman, 65, agreed to talk about her mother but knew almost nothing about the orphan photographed with her mother on the LaGuardia tarmac. She remembered a rare conversation about her mother's past, Ms. Altman said, when Jean told her about her marriage to Bert Simons. By then, Jean lived in Los Angeles and had a new family with her second husband. She and Bert married much too young, Jean told her, and she was miserable. Before Bert joined the army, Ms. Altman recalled her mother telling her, she had 2 abortions. While Bert was overseas, Jean fell in love with a neighbor. She planned to tell Bert she wanted a divorce when he got back from his service, when she got word of Bela's adoption. When she found out about the adoption, it was already done and she had no say in it, said Ms. Altman. She didn't really tell me how it resolved itself, she just told me it was an overwhelming moment and really difficult. After that conversation, Ms. Altman said, she never heard about Bela from her mother again. Years later, leafing through Jean's old photo albums, Ms. Altman was reminded of the conversation with her mother. I saw her life with Bertie, and in the back there was this picture that was just floating there, of this little girl, and I thought, gee, I wonder if that's the orphan. By then, Jean was suffering from Alzheimer's disease and Ms. Altman couldn't ask her questions. In 2013 a genealogist emailed Ms. Altman about Bela Simons. He'd been hired by Captain Nowelski's family to locate survivors he'd helped during the war. Ms. Altman didn't have answers, she didn't even know if Bela was alive. A few days later, the genealogist wrote back to her to tell her that Bela had been adopted by Bert's sister Lottie, and that she was alive. When Lottie Simons first met Abraham Saperstein, at a tuberculosis sanitarium in Saranac Lake, he told her he was going to marry her. Which he did. They lived on Long Island, where Abraham had a medical practice, and both were active members of the local temple, the country club and various charitable organizations. In 1933 their son, Raymond, was born. Lottie, often in and out of the hospital struggling with TB, was told she couldn't bear more children. It is quite likely that when Bert arranged to adopt a German orphan, he had his sister in mind as the mother. Before meeting Bela, he asked Lottie about her full requirements and promised to send photographs. With her authorization, he wrote, he would arrange to make authentic contact with a youngster. He referred to Bela, whom he almost immediately began calling Ruth, as Lottie's child from the get-go. While adopting a war orphan in Europe was exceedingly difficult, obtaining a visa was almost unheard of. Apart from a peak in the early 20th century, nearly 12,000 arrivals at Ellis Island were processed in a single day. In April 1907, immigration into the United States had been generally restricted over the years. The Immigration Act of 1924 limited the number of immigrants based on a national origins quota, resulting in the restriction of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, Africa, the Middle East and Asia. During the Depression, President Herbert Hoover encouraged the State Department to reduce the number of visas issued. It became very difficult for individuals to enter the U.S. once the war had begun. A 1939 Gallup poll found that 67% of Americans opposed accepting refugee children from Germany. But as details of the mass murder in Europe emerged, President Franklin D. Roosevelt came under international pressure to help rescue Nazi victims. Roosevelt circumvented the immigration quotas of 1924 by establishing the Oswego internment camp. He opened up an unused military shelter in Fort Ontario, in Oswego, NY, for 983 refugees to come in as guests, under the provision that they'd return to Europe after the war. Historians have found it impossible to estimate the number of children orphaned by the war. Some children came to the United States under the premise that they'd stay with relatives. Many bounced around different homes, said Beth B. Cohen, a historian and the author of Case Closed, Holocaust survivors in post-war America. Children like Bela, who often didn't know their own name, age, or hometown, were transferred to orphanages around Europe. Jewish organizations encouraged orphans to be sent to communal settlements, or kibbutzim, in Palestine. Bela herself was slated to ship off to Palestine. But Sergeant Simon's military connections, combined with his sister's financial resources and community connections, changed her fate. Days after meeting Bela, he actually kidnapped her. At one point, Bela was transferred to a displaced persons camp in the British zone without his knowledge. When officials refused to release her to him, Sergeant Simons bundled her up in his GI overcoat, and they took off in his jeep. According to an article that ran that April in the Grouper, a weekly newspaper of the American military in Germany, high-ranking brass gave him a pass. He wasn't charged. Sergeant Simons managed to place Ruth in a private home in Berlin under UN supervision, where she would receive personal care and he could visit more frequently. His letters to Lottie during this time describe a near obsession with Ruth's plight. He reached out to Jewish welfare organizations helping refugees, the State Department in Berlin and the Judge Advocate General's office. Meanwhile, Bert urged Lottie to use her connections in the community to lobby congressmen. Among those, he mentioned New York Representative Emanuel Seller, a key immigration advocate who had been in Congress since 1923, and who had spoken out against the Immigration Act of 1924. 3 months of incessant hustle after their initial contact, Sergeant Simons officially adopted Bela. 2 weeks later, despite Americans' profound ambivalence to refugees, President Harry S. Truman issued the Truman Directive on December 22, 1945, which allowed limited immigration from war-torn Europe. He really did believe that the U.S. should live up to its reputation as a beacon of light, said Alan Kraut, a professor of history at American University. The directive emphasized displaced persons and that the majority of refugees coming in be orphans. Still, it took almost 4 months before Berlin's newly opened U.S. consulate awarded the first visa. After the American consulate in Berlin opened in March, it promised Sergeant Simons that the first visa out of Berlin would go to Bela. On April 22, the visa was approved. Today was sort of a climactic day, with picture-taking by various news agencies, Bert wrote to Lottie. This was done against my personal judgment, but with the approval of the local consulate officials, for reasons best known to themselves. Ruth was to fly to New York as soon as transportation could be arranged. The morning of Ruth's arrival, Lottie, Abe, and Ray, who had hardly slept the night before, skipped breakfast, arriving at LaGuardia Field hours ahead of schedule. Lottie waited in the shadows. The plane did not come in until 9:07 a.m. and the waiting was almost too much to stand, Lottie wrote in a scrapbook entry. Jean tried to avoid the reporters but was eventually discovered and surrounded. I cried and would have run to her, but now Abe and Ray were at my side and reminded me of the importance of discretion. Only a little while longer and then Ruthie, my baby, would be in my arms. In 2005 Ruth was contacted by an Israeli man researching his family history. It turned out they were related. Ruth's biological mother was his aunt. They exchanged phone calls and corresponded a few times, but eventually communication dwindled. Ruth has no interest in visiting Germany, despite being offered a ticket by an aunt. Her life is squarely in the United States. She recalls growing up in a rowdy household. Her mother was one of 10 children and her father was one of 6. Aunts and uncles visited often. Not Bert, though. In 1948 he moved to Richmond, Virginia, where he met his new wife, a schoolteacher, and started a business making kitchen cabinets. After making a child's future his mission for so long, he and his wife never had children of their own. After Bert left for Virginia, Ruth saw him maybe once a year at family gatherings. In 1972 she went to his funeral. He was an average guy, nothing special, said Ruth. He was special to me because of what he did, but he was an average person. Ruth herself lives an average American life. By summer, the air outside her Yorktown home was warmer, the U.S. flag still planted firmly by the house. Inside, though, the living room walls were bare, the family photographs all packed away. After years in the same suburban house, Ruth and Ted had packed up their home. Ruth was uprooting herself again. In August, she and her husband moved to a suburb of Myrtle Beach, SC, to start the next chapter of their life.